speaker, which is Samson Esayas and comes from the University of Oslo, where he's a PhD candidate, right?
Yes.
His main research interests are data privacy and, of course, competition law, among others. And his PhD thesis topic is commercialization of personal data from a competition law perspective. The topic of his presentation is privacy as a non-price competition parameter, theories of harm and mergers, right?
Okay, thank you, Carmen, for the introduction. So as Carmen introduced, my topic is on privacy as a non-price competition parameter and what are really the theories of harm that might be used to assess whether a merger kind of reduces competition in privacy. So this is related. In the last few years, we have seen that privacy issues entering into competition discussions, particularly when you have companies in data-rich industries, or you can call it big data, try to merge. Examples are like the Google DoubleClick merger, then the Facebook WhatsApp merger, and recently the Microsoft LinkedIn merger. So the question is whether, given that these kind of mergers raise the potential for integration of data, the question that arose in those mergers was whether there is a role for competition law to play in this, in regarding to privacy. And at the beginning, competition authorities were quite skeptic in recognizing that whether competition law can play some role in relation to privacy. But in the last few years, they have come to recognize that maybe competition law can play some role. One approach that competition authorities are trying to do is to include privacy as a non-price competition parameter into the assessment. This has happened, for example, in the Facebook WhatsApp merger, where the Commission recognized or at least mentioned that data privacy is a key competition parameter for consumer communication services, but did not go further to analyze how that competition is manifested or how that competition might be affected. But more recently, in the Microsoft LinkedIn case, the Commission went a little further and analyzed how the merger might actually foreclose companies that are trying to provide a better level of privacy than LinkedIn, and how that might affect the level of privacy. But given this is quite an emerging area, there are quite a number of unanswered questions, even sometimes confusions on what do we mean competition in privacy? How is this competition manifested? When do we consider two companies competing in data privacy? And what is added value? At least in European law, there is data privacy rules specifically addressing the privacy concerns. So why do we need to bring data privacy issues into competition? And what are the theories of harm? How do you make it concrete, this approach of privacy as a non-price parameter, and apply it into concrete merger cases? So what are the theories of harm that competition authorities are trying to use or might use in assessing the merger assessments? So just before proceeding further, I just want to make one point of caution. This is quite a very experimental phase. Competition authorities are just starting to try to experiment how is privacy might be as a non-price competition parameter or the quality parameter. So the paper is also part of this experimentation. What might be the possibilities to integrate this data privacy as a non-price competition parameter? So this is the structure of the paper. So in the paper, I start by looking at some of the decisions that recognize data privacy as a competition parameter, and some of the decisions I have already mentioned, the Microsoft LinkedIn and the Facebook WhatsApp merger, and some some national member states approach to recognize this privacy as a non-price competition parameter. And then I discuss more generally the role of non-price parameters in mergers, and then how data privacy might fit into this as a non-price competition parameter, particularly address what are the dimensions of privacy we talk about. When do we see that two companies are competing based on privacy, and what's the added value? And then I try to also analyze three different theories of harm that could be used to, or could be used to experiment to incorporate privacy as a non-price competition parameter. So I won't cover all those issues, but I will just highlight some of the main issues. So one of well, just a background on why this issue, this data privacy is becoming an interest for competition law. One of the outcomes of this commercialization of personal data is that in the last few years that we have seen an increased number of mergers focusing on data-rich industries. Earlier today we have talked about the need for scope and variety of data for companies to gain some competitive advantage. And one manifestation of this is companies start to acquire startups that they see might have valuable insight into consumer data. And good examples of these kind of acquisitions are Google's acquisition of DoubleClick and Google's acquisition of Waze, Facebook's acquisition of Instagram, WhatsApp, and recently the TBH, or to be honest, and then Microsoft's acquisition of LinkedIn. And this kind of measures normally raise two main issues broadly. One is the data dimension, the concentration of data that we touched upon earlier today, whether the combining of the data in the hands of the merging entities could actually give rise to concentration in certain markets, particularly in the advertising market. But the other is the privacy dimension. What role is there for competition law to play in relation to this kind of mergers that implicate data privacy? But I will only focus on the privacy implications, particularly privacy as a non-price competition parameter. So as I mentioned briefly, the first case that come to recognize that data privacy could be considered as a non-price competition parameter is the Facebook WhatsApp case in 2014, where the commission said that data privacy is an important competition parameter for consumer communication services. But as I mentioned, it did not go to address what theory of harm and how this competition is manifested. But more recently, the commission even went further and analyzed that it recognized first that data privacy is a significant factor of quality between professional social networks, but also it went to analyze some different theory of harm, how that merger might affect this competition. But as I mentioned again, there are many questions in terms of market definition, how this competition is manifested, and what's added value, and what are the theory of harm. So I would just give you an overview of some of those questions. So the first question is, what's the added value? At least in Europe, where we have at least relatively stronger data protection rules, why do we bring data privacy into competition? Isn't just a waste of resource? And as yesterday Marco tried to mention, well, of course, existence of regulation is one thing, but it doesn't matter for competition to have a regulation. As the Commission tried to justify in its decision in Facebook WhatsApp merger, what matters is that consumers are trying to value their privacy, and the market is trying to respond to that privacy as we see it with the emergence of at least communication services or services focusing on privacy and security. And the other is that, at least in some markets, data privacy could be also a constraint or a competitive constraint on the behavior of firms. This is particularly the case when you have a multi-sided or two-sided markets, where one side of the market is subsidized by targeted advertisements that use consumer data. So when you assess market power in the advertising market, you need to take consideration that the behavior of that company in the advertising market might be affected by or might be constrained by the privacy consideration. Otherwise, there is a risk of false positives in the assessment. This is the case what the Commission did in the Facebook WhatsApp. It considered that the potential for WhatsApp to introduce advertisement in its service might be constrained by privacy considerations of WhatsApp users. Whether privacy considerations are effective competitive constraints is something new, but there are still constraints that need to be considered. And from a data privacy perspective, one advantage of incorporating data privacy into competition assessment might be that, as you know, data privacy rules normally impose minimum protections, but also they impose maximum protections, because they have two double objectives, that is protection of privacy, but at the same time facilitating the flow of personal data among states. So there is a limit to what level of privacy that member states or the European Union can be provided in order to achieve this free flow of data. So incorporating data privacy into competition might aspire companies to provide even higher level of protection than what the rules provide or what regulation can provide, because we know also the enforcement challenges with data privacy. And the other is, the second question is, what are the dimensions of privacy that are relevant for competition? And this question is inspired by the Commission's decision in Facebook WhatsApp. And what's interesting is that the Commission, as I mentioned, said that data privacy is an important competition parameter for Facebook and WhatsApp, for Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. But when reasoning that these two services, Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp, are not competitors or are complementary, the Commission used the difference in the way they collect data. So what the Commission said is that the fact that, contrary to WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger enables Facebook to collect data regarding its users that is used for purposes of advertisement. So the fact that Facebook collects data and uses for advertisement, but WhatsApp doesn't do that, was taken to conclude that they are not competitors. They are rather complementaries. So this is basically a reflection of the conventional view that the more similar the products or the services are, then the more competitors they are. But the question I try to ask is, if we consider data privacy as a key competition parameter, how is this manifested? Is WhatsApp not trying to compete by not collecting data, or by collecting at minimum data as necessary, and by not using the data it collects for advertisement? Isn't this one way of competition in data privacy can be manifested? So I wrote an article about that. In case of data privacy, the competition might be more of dissimilarity, where there is different in the privacy policies of the companies, and then it might be sequential, where one tries to not collect data and might impose some competitive constraints on others. And then, so what brought this was, the consequence of this confusion in the Facebook WhatsApp led me to think, maybe since this is the beginning of discussion on privacy as a non-price competition parameter, we should not take it for granted that competition authorities know all the dimensions of data privacy that are relevant or which companies can use to compete. So we should probably have some kind of starting point to see how that competition might be, what kind of dimensions companies can use to compete on privacy. And of course, there are different mechanisms of doing articulating these attributes. But one would be doing some consumer survey. What kind of privacy feature would consumers value in different services? But as a starting point, we could also use data protection rules. At least in Europe, we can start the GDPR or the data protection regulation as a basis to articulate, okay, how can companies use those features or those principles or to manifest, to compete based on privacy? So we have the data minimization and the purpose limitation principle, which means that companies can compete by not collecting data, or by collecting as minimum data as necessary, or by not sharing that data with other parties. So I will show some examples. Storage limitation means that companies might compete by not storing data at all, or by deleting the data in a very short period of time. Then the transparency principle means that companies can compete based on providing clear and precise data privacy policies. And then you have a list of different attributes we can draw from those rules, including privacy by design means that companies can compete by incorporating end-to-end encryption or other kinds of anonymization techniques. Privacy by default means that companies can compete also by implementing privacy by default. So having this kind of list helps competition authorities to see what kind of things to look when they are assessing mergers. So if for example, DuckDuckGo was an example that comes in mergers, then competition authorities could be easily identify that DuckDuckGo is trying to compete based on some features of data privacy. For example, DuckDuckGo is a search engine that prides itself with protecting privacy, and then in their privacy policy, they mention that they do not collect or store personal data, which means that they are trying to use the data minimization and the purpose limitation principle as a main feature for competition. And does not store personal data. They are trying to compete based on the storage limitation, the encrypt communication between the user and the servers, which means that they are competing by their own data security and privacy by design. They say that they highlight key changes with red text when they change policies, which means that they are trying to compete based on the transparency principle. And then users have to actively turn on location if they want to localize their searches. So this is a feature of privacy by default. So you have to actively activate the location, which means that your location is protected by default. It's only when you do some action that can be, your location will be used. So this gives us a basis for identifying what kind of competition, what kind of dimensions privacy companies might use to compete. Then the third question is, okay, what are the theory of harm? Okay, we say that data privacy is a non-price competition parameter, but what kind of concrete theory of harm can competition authority use or are using in order to implement this approach? So I try to look at three different theory of harm. Privacy as a quality parameter. This is the theory of harm that the Commission tried to apply in the Microsoft LinkedIn merger. And the other is the Maverick firm theory of harm, which is not quite used. The merger guidelines, the horizontal merger guidelines mention the need to consider if there is a Maverick in the merger, but it's not that quite used and not discussed in European competition law. And I also look at the consumer choice approach. So this is basically based on the ordo-liberal thought of that competition should aspire to protect consumer choice and variety. I'm not going to address all of them because there is no time. But the main conclusion is there is a broader leeway to use consumer choice approach, but its prospects under European data, under European competition law is quite limited, especially when it comes to mergers. Although there is some possibility that the consumer choice approach is reflected in the decisions of the Commission and the European courts when it comes to Article 1 or 2, and more specifically on price-related conducts, then its importance for mergers is quite limited. But I'll give you a highlight of the two other theory of harms, the privacy as a quality parameter and the Maverick firm theory of harm.
You still have 15 minutes.
Okay, yeah, good. So the quality-based theory of harm, and this was initially articulated or proposed by Professor Peter Swire in the FTC testimony regarding the Google DoubleClick merger. So his argument was that Google collects huge, deep amount of personal data based on its hundreds of services that users use, and then DoubleClick is able to collect also the tracking behavior, which websites you visit, because they serve advertisements. So in the websites that DoubleClick serves advertisement, then they know which websites you have visited, and they have data about you on those websites. So the aggregation of this Google's deep, which includes the number of variety of data, and then DoubleClick's broad array of consumer data might reduce the quality of search. So here is about, we are talking about the search market. So Swire's argument is that if Google starts to provide you with a search result that combines the data of DoubleClick and Google itself, then that might constitute a reduction in data privacy. But FTC did not accept with it, did not agree with this proposition, and it did not go further in the discussion. And then the first case that came to recognize privacy as a non-price competition parameter was the Facebook WhatsApp merger. So here the Commission said that Facebook privacy is a very important parameter of competition for consumer communication services, but did not really come up with a theory of harm. It did ignore basically how that merger might affect that data privacy of individuals. And the Commission clearly said that a combination of data as such, concerns from the combination of the data are not competition law issues, they are data privacy law issues. So basically it excluded that possible data privacy concerns from the combination of Facebook's and WhatsApp's data is not something that competition law need to be concerned. But in assessing whether Facebook is able to use WhatsApp's data for advertisement purposes, the Commission did indirectly highlighted how reduction in privacy might happen. So here the Commission was assessing whether data privacy concerns can constrain the merged entity, which is Facebook, from using WhatsApp's data for advertisement. So what the Commission said that actually, data privacy concerns would constrain Facebook from using WhatsApp's data, because in order to use Facebook, for Facebook to use WhatsApp's data, first WhatsApp should start collecting more data, because it does not at that time possess much data that could be useful for advertisement. And in addition to that, WhatsApp had also to abandon its encryption in order for that data to be useful for targeted advertisement. So the Commission saw that it's unlikely that this would happen because it would constrain their merged entities. So here, the Commission is not addressing privacy as such, privacy theory of how the merger reduces privacy as such, but it's articulating indirectly that, okay, privacy reductions might occur if the merger leads to incentive to collect more data, or if the merger leads to incentive to abandon the end-to-end encryption. So these are something that could be drawn from those discussions. So what I tried to do in the paper is also, well, after the merger, we have seen that WhatsApp have changed its policy and started to share the data with Facebook. So one of the arguments is that, of course, it's in hindsight, it's normally easier to argue after what happened. But nonetheless, I try to analyze that the merger and the post-merger behavior is quite an indication that the merger has reduced WhatsApp's incentive not to collect data and not to use that data for advertisement. This is because at the time of the merger, Facebook was quite an established network, and what WhatsApp was trying to do was to attract users from that network by offering a little bit better privacy protection, by not collecting data, by using end-to-end encryption, but also charging a small nominal fee. At that moment, WhatsApp was charging at least €1 for many users. And the Commission investigation really shows that WhatsApp was actually succeeding in attracting users from Facebook, because almost 90% of WhatsApp users were also users of Facebook. And the Commission at the same time noted that in comparison, the Facebook Messenger was provided a richer functionality than actually WhatsApp. So the argument is that the merger might have removed this. In a sense, Facebook served as a constraint on WhatsApp's behavior. In order to keep the Facebook users, to keep WhatsApp or to keep using WhatsApp, WhatsApp had to provide a bit different, had to try to differentiate itself from Facebook, and it used privacy as a key differentiator. And then, following the merger, it might have removed that constraint that Facebook imposed on WhatsApp. And what's interesting is the Commission have actually changed a little, and then in the Microsoft LinkedIn merger, it has actually assessed how the merger might actually reduce or affect the level of privacy. As I mentioned earlier, it recognized that data privacy is a significant factor of quality for professional social networks, and it analyzed that how if Microsoft started to pre-install LinkedIn in its Windows operating system, as well as integrate it with Office products such as Outlook and Microsoft Word, then it might foreclose competition in the market for professional social networks. And the Commission clearly articulated this foreclosure, possible foreclosure of competing professional social networks would harm users in two ways. One is, users would not have many options. They will be left only with LinkedIn, and that would be a reduction in consumer warfare, but also it identified that data privacy is one of also one of the victims of this foreclosure, because in some member states there was a professional social network provider, Zing, I think it operates in Germany and Austria mainly, and it provides a better privacy protection. So the argument of the Commission is that if Microsoft starts to pre-install LinkedIn and integrate LinkedIn with Office products, it also forecloses those companies that are trying to compete based on different levels of privacy, and that would also affect the quality, because the users would be left with LinkedIn that offers lesser data privacy. So the Commission articulates that Zing provides a greater degree of privacy than LinkedIn, because first, during the registration process, users have to actively accept Zing's privacy policy and terms and conditions by clicking a specific box. So the Commission compared this, while if you are joining LinkedIn, what you have to do is basically to click the Join Now button. So you do not have to agree specifically to the privacy policies. It's just enough that you click the Join Now button. And the Commission identified as well that when Zing changes or makes changes to its services that might affect data privacy, then it also actively seeks consent from users. And in addition to that, if users do not agree to new changes, they can still keep using the existing service. So they are not denied of the existing, they are not denied of continuing to use existing services if there are some changes, if they do not agree with the new changes. So these are clearly some of the features that we recognize from data privacy law. So qualities of consent. So when we talk about consent, we say that it should be freely given, informed, and unambiguous. So actively seeking consent means that it appeals to that the consent is unambiguous. You could see that the LinkedIn way of receiving consent is also unambiguous, but Zing's is a different, higher level of unambiguity. And it explicitly seeks active consent when there are changes, means that it's trying to inform users and get also, again, unambiguous consent. And then the fact that users are able to keep using existing services without being denied means that it relates with freely given, because they are not forced to accept new changes in order to keep using the service. They can still deny their consent and then continue to use existing service. So the argument of the Commission is that the foreclosure would deprive users or would reduce the quality of data privacy. And Microsoft agreed to implement some measures. So I'll just keep some of these. So just to point out that some of the points that I want to make in relation to this is that first, there is this understanding that when we talk about reduction in privacy, most people understand reduction in data privacy as an increase in the amount of personal data collected. But it's not necessarily, that could be one aspect of reduction in data privacy, but there are broader areas of features that could be used to also assess reduction in privacy. The LinkedIn Microsoft case is one where the quality of consent was very important. And then the Facebook WhatsApp merger also involves that abandoning encryption could be also another factor. Another point is that reduction in privacy, it does not really, it can still fit within existing anti-competitive conduct. So the case with the Microsoft LinkedIn case was Microsoft was trying to bundle, or at least potentially bundling LinkedIn with Office products and Microsoft operating system, and that might foreclose companies that are offering better privacy. And it also demonstrates that you don't really necessarily need to quantify reductions in privacy. Foreclosure could have an impact on that. So,
2 more minutes.
Okay. So I'll briefly highlight the Maverick.
Very briefly.
Okay. So the second theory of harm I try to discuss is the Maverick firm theory of harm. So the idea is that sometimes in a market you have a company that tries to do something different. And if the merger involves that kind of company, even though that company might have a very low market share, then we might need to consider the anti-competitive impact of this role. And as I mentioned, in the in the European Union, in the Commission horizontal merger guidelines, there is this concept of Maverick to be used, but it has not been used that often. And so the idea is that if a company plays a disruptive role, either by using price mechanisms or non-price mechanisms, adopting a very different business strategies, then its acquisition by other companies might have anti-competitive effect. But the problem with the Maverick theory of harm, at least in the literature and also from US court cases, is that competition authorities do not highlight, okay, when do we say a company is a maverick? When do we say that a company is disrupting the market by using a different strategy, including price mechanisms? So what I try to do is to look at the business literature in terms of what is disruptive innovation? How is disruptive innovation defined in the business literature? And I try to look low-end, and in that literature there's a distinction between two kinds of disruptive innovations, low-end footholds and new market footholds. And the low-end foothold is where a company with a fewer resource try to target overlooked segments of consumers, often by low prices or catering to different niche interests of those consumers. So I try to apply the low-end foothold Maverick theory of harm to data privacy. So I substantiate that normally with from the literature. I try to identify 5 requirements of implementing this Maverick theory, and then try to apply to a very hypothetical case of possible acquisition of duck.com, for example, by Google. So why do I do this? Of course, like I mentioned, this is a very early stage, so there is no concrete case to apply the Maverick firm theory. But also, Margaret Vestager, which is the commissioner, is a big fan of DuckDuckGo, so there might be some problems there. But that aside, often when you talk about data privacy in mergers, this is the example that you find in the literature. So a report from the OECD says that if Google was to acquire DuckDuckCom, then that merger would reduce the privacy of users and then harm consumer welfare. And also in their book on big data and competition policy, Stucker and Grunes also say that this merger would reduce consumer harm by harming the privacy preferences. So, but they do not really provide a clear theory of harm, how how authorities can implement these, can actually assess this merger using what theory of harm. So I try to see that actually the Maverick firm theory of harm could be used in this assessment, and yeah, I try to apply that into this potential hypothetical merger. So I just stop here and probably open the floor for.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I will open the floor for any questions and answers or suggestions or comments that you might have, and if you don't have, then we'll quickly go for lunch because we are in a rush, no? This time for lunch was pretty short. Yeah, so questions, please, Michelle.
Thank you for
Yeah, so regarding your first question on the privacy paradox, and yeah, of course, the challenges, I think that's a very important limitation to rely or expect the market to address the privacy interest or privacy preferences of users, and but I mean we see that increasingly users, some use at least even as minority of users do actually value, and I mean DuckDuckGo, the search engine has been growing over 55% for the last 5 years. So there has been at least an interest from even though a small group of users trying to still to to go to services that try to protect their personal data. And we have also seen that with messaging services, the rise of Signal and Telegram a little bit, although they normally depend on moments where there is a big event. So the idea is that, of course, there are challenges with the privacy paradox and behavioral constraints, but at some moment we still need to protect the interests of these people. So if a merger is going to eliminate those, even is going to harm even a small group of people, then I think that's something that competition law authorities should be able to see. I think the Facebook WhatsApp merger is a clear instance that where users had better options before the merger, where there was a messaging service without advertisement, with less collection of data, but the competition authorities did not even analyze how that merger might actually change the incentives of WhatsApp to change the policies. Plus, I think it should be possible to factor in those paradoxes into assessment. So one example is in the case, for example, in the Facebook WhatsApp merger, one assumption of the commission was that users are able to constrain behavior of data or policy changes of the companies. So it assumed that if WhatsApp changes privacy policies, users would shift. But it did not take into account that the policy changes could be obscure. That's exactly what WhatsApp did. It did not tell exactly what it's doing. It just asks you, okay, there are changes to privacy, agree to these privacy policies. So you need to factor also the behavioral challenges that are hindering users to actually switch. So I think there is some loop there, and yeah.
Okay, we have a second question over there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think no, No, I think you have a good point. I mean, yeah, most of the market failures are the privacy paradox and the information asymmetry and are from the demand side. And there is less role for competition law to play when the market failures are really related to the demand side. But the point, but it's not completely only also the demand side problem, because those demand side problems also transfer to the supply side. So the problem is that increasingly consumers are, I mean, when companies start to deceive consumers in terms of privacy, because they don't tell the whole story, what's happening with their data, and there is always something bad happening which the companies are not telling, then consumers develop this cynicism that even when a company that offers a better service comes, they don't really also trust. So there is this problem of the demand side also affecting the supply side, because even a company who is really wants to protect privacy comes up, they're not going to trust because this company is going to do the same. And companies that are offering better services, better privacy services, would not be able to attract enough demand from consumers. So it's quite related. I discussed that as well in my paper, drawing from the paper on economics, paper on dysfunctional equilibrium. So the demand side actually also affects the supply side. And sometimes some company might succeed, even break that dysfunctional equilibrium. When that company breaks that equilibrium, then competition law need to protect that kind of. So that's what Facebook did actually. There were many challenges to actually charge and protect privacy. I think Mikhail talks about the free effect in her paper, at least in one of her papers. So normally consumers are not willing to pay for protecting their privacy, but WhatsApp was managing to succeed a little bit, at least. They were charging a small amount of money and trying to protect personal data. But then at that point, then competition law need to consider that, okay, the company have already broken this chain of barriers to attract based on privacy, then maybe that we should take into account of some of the privacy considerations when that kind of merger happens. I think that the Maverick theory of harm also considers that. That's when someone tries to do different things and then try to succeed, then we need to take. I mean, this will happen, for example, if there is a big ad blocker, if there is a success in the ad blocker and one company, Google or Facebook, starts to buy it, we should not just keep, I think competition law would have a role to play. If we have, now we are also seeing companies trying to give users more control, the personal data stores or data value. If those companies succeed at some point, then we should also consider those kind of. Yeah.
So, any more questions there? No? So we can stop here and go directly to the launch, which will take place here in the lobby, in the main entrance, right? And afterwards, we'll go once again upstairs to the third. We remain here. So we will remain here, which is a bit of a chaos, but